Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I hope you can hear me. My name is Francesco Branca. I am going to be your moderator. I'm speaking to you from Geneva early in the morning, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session. In fact, it's the first of two sessions on food system transformation challenges. And we have a very interesting panel today. We have Professor Jessica Fanzo, who is with us online today. Professor Fanzo is professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Then we have Dr. Denny Hunter, who is the principal scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the CIAT in Australia. And then you have somebody with you in person, luckily. And these are Dr. Vanida Kamnipet. She is the director of the Bureau of Foreign Agricultural Affairs of the Office of Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperatives in Thailand. And last but not least, Mrs. Abigail Johnson. She's a medical student, a climate activist, and a youth advocate in the UNICEF and AstraZeneca Young Leaders Program from Barbados. So you see really a panel from all over the world on a topic which is really critical because we are now fully aware of the impact of food systems on climate change and the environment. We'll hear about this from Professor Jessica Fanzo, but also we'll be looking at specifically the impact on agrobiodiversity. In fact, this is one of the parameters of the impact of food systems on our planetary boundaries. But we'll not only speak about the challenges, we'll speak about the solutions, and particularly we'll hear the experience of Thailand, and we'll hear how youth activism is actually changing the picture and is such a big driver from transformation. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome again Professor Jessica Fanzo and give her the floor. Jessica, the floor is yours, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Branca. It's a real pleasure, of course, to be with you on a panel. You're such an incredible giant in nutrition, and I'm always I feel very honored every time I get to be with you in a session. I hope you can see my screen. So this session is about food system transformation challenges, and I'm going to lay out some of the challenges as Dr. Branca had articulated, but I think a lot of us, the other panelists will be talking about some of the solutions to these challenges. So it won't be all negative. It'll be also somewhat positive and driven towards what we can do for positive transformation. So for those of you who don't work so much in food systems or work maybe more on health systems, like health systems, food systems are quite complex. We have many components of food systems, food supply chains, food environments. People are engaging with food supply chains and these environments where consumers go to make choices and purchase food. And food systems have many outcomes, if you see on the right: environmental outcomes, nutrition and health outcomes, economic and social outcomes. And of course, food systems are influenced by many different drivers, as you can see on the left: climate change, urbanization, income growth and distribution, population growth and pressure and migration, globalization and trade. And what you see when you look at these many boxes across this diagram of food systems, there's many different components of food systems. They interact in different ways and positive and negative feedbacks. And there's many actors that engage in this food systems. And that's what makes transformation of food systems and all of their diversity quite complex. So I'm going to talk about why we need to transform food systems. Some people would argue food systems are functioning just fine. I get food every day. I'm able to feed myself and my family. But food systems are fragile, and we'll see why that is. And I would argue that there's really 10 large reasons as to why we need to transform food systems, but some of the challenges that food systems face. The first is that food systems contribute to climate change and environmental degradation. The way we grow food, the way we produce food and process food is contributing to global greenhouse gas emissions. Roughly somewhere between 21 and 37% of total greenhouse gas emissions comes from food systems. Agriculture alone uses about 70% of all fresh water resources. Because of the way we grow and move food, we are threatening biodiversity, and Danny Hunter will talk about a lot about this, and a potential extinction of some species. And we are depleting the fish stocks around the world. And when we look at who's emitting a lot of greenhouse gases from their food systems, there's roughly about 6 economies that are contributing about half of those greenhouse gases: China, Brazil, US, India, Indonesia, and the EU. So they are the countries that need to take the most action in transforming their food systems when we think about climate change. Adversely, on the opposite side, climate change is impacting food systems. We know that climate change will have adverse impacts on crop yields. Um, Things like maize, soybeans, rice will see under a CO2 fertilization effect or higher CO2 in the atmosphere. Some crops, their yield and the quantity of those foods will decline. We also know that under this CO2 type effect, we will see declines in the nutritional quality of some crops, 20% declines in protein, 14% declines in iron, 15% declines in zinc. So, climate change is not only going to impact the ability to grow enough food, but the nutritional quality of those foods. Another challenge is the way we manage land. Um, about 40% of the land surface is used to grow food, but 77% of that land is used to raise livestock, beef, and dairy. But of that livestock, they only contribute about 18% of calories and about 37% of protein. If we're dealing with land scarcity issues and finite lands, is this the best way to use those lands to grow large animals that require a lot of resources, but are not necessarily feeding the world in equitable ways? Another challenge, and I don't think I need to say this, are pandemics, and they're not going anywhere, and we may face more in the future. Um, I know that's dismal and doomish to say as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, hopefully. But we are dealing with potential rise in other zoonotic pandemics. And why do I say this, and why does this matter for food systems? Well, 60% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, and of that, 72% originate in wildlife. Now, food and agriculture play a big role in zoonotic spillover events. When we infringe on, destroy, or force wildlife to move, we put them closer to domestic animals, we put them closer to humans, putting ourselves and animals at risk for more of these zoonotic spillover events. The fifth challenge we face with our agriculture productivity, particularly, is the lack of diversity. And this puts us at climate risk, this puts us at nutrition risk. We have so many different types of crops that can be used for food, but we only focus on a handful of crops. Rice, maize, wheat provide about 50% of the world's calories, and 12 crops with 5 animal species provide about 75% of the world's food. That is incredibly risky when we think about the impacts of climate and the ability to get enough nutrients from the overall food basket of what we could provide. And we know that diversity is declining in many places. In Asia and in Africa, we see that there's much less focus on local varieties of crops and much more focus on monocrop cultures, modern varieties that lack genetic diversity. And Danny will probably go into that in much more detail, but it's quite alarming when we think about the declines in biodiversity, and food systems are contributing to that. The sixth challenge is that inequities are deepening and plaguing progress. 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. That's incredible. And what that means is not only people can't meet their nutritional needs, but they're not eating or not able to access a protective diet for their health. And if you look at the brown, it shows Africa, 75 to 100% of the population can't afford a healthy diet. The types of diets that people are eating is a challenge. We see this rise in ultra processed foods, foods high in sugar, salts, and unhealthy fats. And we see this really across most regions of the world. These foods are cheap, they're convenient, they're easily traded across the world. And these foods have detrimental impacts to health. And all of this is leading to, and I think what this audience cares about, challenge number 8 being the scale of malnutrition. Many people in the world are suffering from one or more forms of malnutrition, and this is Francesco Branca's bread and butter. We still have a huge number of children who are stunted and wasted, children who are overweight, and these are children who are under the age of 5. We have 2.2 billion people who are overweight or obese, as measured by a somewhat flawed indicator being body mass index. And now, with the Ukraine crisis, climate, and COVID, the 3 C's, conflict, COVID, and climate, we have more and more people who are at high risk of acute food insecurity. So we really have a pretty devastating situation happening on the burden of malnutrition. And while progress has been made on reducing undernutrition, it just hasn't been fast enough. And so many countries are, while reducing their undernutrition, are starting to have this overweight, obesity, and non-communicable disease burden, which complicates being able to get to zero malnutrition and zero hunger. And my last 2 slides, just quickly, food systems are increasingly, and I think everyone in the world is recognizing, vulnerable to shocks, climate and weather event shocks, geopolitical and economic event shocks, mismanagement, poor policy change shocks. And we see that across crops, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture. And the frequency of these shocks, shown in the red bars, is increasing, putting us at further risk for multiple breadbasket failures and more food insecurity. And I think last, the biggest challenge that some of us face in the nutrition is the power imbalances, that they're problematic and unjust. Are governments in control of their food system? Who's controlling food systems and how they're shaped? And is that control benefiting public health and environmental sustainability? This is a massive issue when we have significant consolidation and concentration of the private sector across supply chains, across all aspects of supply chains. And dealing with that and controlling that is very difficult for many governments. And it's a significant problem, as we saw with some of the protests against the UN Food Systems Summit. And this is something we need to wrangle with. And so we're really in this time of the 3 C's and the 5 F's, climate change, COVID, and conflict, that are impacting food, fodder, finance, fertilizer, and fuel, major resources that help us grow food. And it's having significant impacts on food security, diets, nutrition and health, environmental sustainability, and of course, many of the livelihoods of those food actors working in food systems. So we have a pretty grand challenge, but the solutions are there. It's just a matter of political will and scaling those up. And my last slide, Francesco, is just showing that if we want to still achieve the Paris climate change targets, we absolutely have to take action on food systems. If we just work on the energy sector, the transportation sector, we will not meet the Paris climate change targets. We absolutely have to do something in food. And even better would be to improve agriculture, efficiency, yields, move towards plant-based diets, particularly for high-income countries that consume too much meat, and reduce food loss and waste. And we need to do all of those well if we want to achieve the Paris climate change targets. Thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jessica. This is really remarkable synthesis of the big challenges that the food system has. It's clear that it's a crisis, and I can hear somehow a sense of frustration in your words that the crisis is actually out of control, and is certainly out of our control. So I hope in the rest of the panel and discussion, we'll be able to see how actually this can come back in democratic people's control, and how food system transformation can actually be triggered. And we've had some good signs of that, but we'll speak about that in the second part of our conversation. Before we actually go in the discussion, I would like to ask Danny to join the panel, I think on stage, Danny Hunter, and he will give us a more in-depth discussion around one of the challenges, which is the biodiversity challenge.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah, I'm here, Francesco, and thank you very much, Francesco, for the invitation to be on this panel. And I'd also like to thank PMAC Secretariat for the invitation to be at PMAC 2023. And also acknowledging my fellow panelists, Abigail and Vanita, who will join us up here in a few moments. And of course, it was really nice to see you, Jessica. It's a long time since we've met in person, and I hope we can do that soon, sometime this year. So I'm just going to pick up on challenge number 5 that Jessica highlighted, the loss of diversity in our food systems, and why that food biodiversity matters, and just highlight some examples of what we can do about it in certain contexts. And it is quite a challenge, and there's a number of barriers and a number of difficulties that need to be overcome. Just to recap what Jessica highlighted, out of the thousands of plants that have been documented historically, less than 200 are currently contributing to our global food system. We rely on 9 plants to provide 70% of our total food production, crop production. And it's really essentially 3 plant species, rice, wheat, and maize, that provide more than 50% of the world's plant-derived calories. And I just wanted to highlight a same graphic that Jessica had put up on our 5th slide. This is going horizontally, whereas Jessica's was vertically. And this is just focusing on species diversity, and mostly plant species diversity, and the loss of species diversity over the last couple of centuries. Now, a lot of this can be traced back to the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and how food systems have developed from that. But it's just not only the loss of plant species. We're also losing quite dramatically animal species, animal breeds, especially small native livestock breeds, chickens, goats, native pigs, native ducks, and so forth. And it's also a loss of fish diversity and aquatic diversity. And something that's also not often touched upon, at the same time we're losing a lot of below ground biodiversity in terms of how we produce food, especially in monoculture systems and industrial agriculture. So I want to move away from the species diversity and look at the genetic diversity. That diversity that you would find within a particular species or a particular crop or a particular type of animal species. Jessica also highlighted this in her graphic on slide number 5 on the right-hand side when she highlighted the loss of traditional varieties over the last number of years in Asia and Africa and the move towards more uniform varieties. And this is just a graphic that highlights basically the same kind of thing except for vegetables over the last century or so. And above the gray horizontal bar is the genetic diversity of varieties that existed in a range of vegetables and how that's changed over the last 100 years or so to really narrow down on a very specific group of varieties that are largely now bred and available for industrial agriculture, industrial agri-food systems. So they're quite uniform in terms of lack of diversity. They've also got characteristics that deal with perishability. You can take things like a modern day carrot, you could take it up in an airplane, you could drop it, and it still wouldn't break on impact on the ground. So there's been a lot of trade-offs in terms of breeding for that uniformity and dealing with issues of perishability in food systems and value chains. And a number of those trade-offs often come across into the organoleptic properties of these varieties that are available. So in terms of their nutritional value, a lot has been lost from some of the very old varieties that were previously used. Also, losses in taste, in texture, in flavors, and smells as well. And why is this important, the loss of genetic diversity? Well, this genetic diversity is really the foundation, the bedrock of future breeding programs. Jessica highlighted the challenges of yield, but she also highlighted the challenges of climate change impact on the nutritional quality of crops. And she provided some examples for protein, zinc, and iron in cereal crops. So a lot of this genetic diversity that is being lost actually has high nutritional value. So it is quite important in terms of quality breeding as well as contributing to improving yields as well. A lot of this genetic diversity is quite resilient in terms of its performance in the field. So it's got very unique properties in dealing with climate change adaptation and diversifying our food systems, diversifying our agricultural production in terms of improving resilience. Oftentimes, it also requires low water inputs and low external chemical inputs. So when incorporated into more diversified food systems, more diversified agricultural production, it can also enhance the sustainability of those production systems by reducing reliance on external inputs. And of course, that in itself is an important characteristic in terms of human health and reducing reliance on health-damaging agrochemicals. Something that has been talked about over the last few days, but I haven't highlighted here, when you lose all of this genetic diversity, these local varieties, native breeds, you also lose a large part of biocultural diversity and the associated traditional knowledge with these varieties. And not just traditional knowledge, but knowledge that also pertains to traditional foodways and traditional production systems. But I just want to focus on the importance of this genetic diversity from a nutritional perspective in terms of the potential of genetic diversity to contribute to enhancing diets, human nutrition, and health. This is just this is a slide from demonstrating genetic diversity among traditional banana varieties in the small island of Ponape, a small island state in the Federated States of Micronesia in the middle of the Pacific. A very, very small landmass, yet it has got some incredible, unique and novel genetic diversity in terms of its staple crops. And this is just highlighting 8 traditional varieties, and there's a cross-section of the banana flesh itself in the plate in the middle. And I just wanted to, I got the pointer? Yeah, just bring your attention to this one particular traditional variety. It's called the carrot variety of banana in Ponape, K-A-R-A-T. Obviously, because it's orange flesh and it resembles a carrot, spelled differently. But when you look at the nutritional composition of the carrot variety and compare it to the carotenoid value of the more commonly available Cavendish banana on the left, the nutritional composition value for carotenoids alone are more than 1,000-fold greater in terms of that traditional banana variety. And this was a variety that was almost lost on Ponape. There was like many small island states, there's a great reliance on imported foods, and that has an impact in terms of local species diversity and also local genetic diversity. And it was really down to the good work of an NGO on Ponape, the island food community of Ponape, that revitalized this traditional variety, this carrot variety. And traditionally, it was used as a traditional weaning food in the Federated States of Micronesia. And if you travel throughout the Pacific, there are many examples of the nutritional diversity of a lot of the different types of traditional varieties in the region. And of course, that 1,000-fold difference in terms of carotenoid content can make a huge amount of difference in terms of the nutritional needs of that young child, and obviously contributing to improving the immune system of people who consume that variety and other similar varieties, and also things like eye health as well. So we've talked about the loss of diversity in plants, the loss of diversity in a lot of our animal and livestock breed, fish diversity, aquatic diversity, below ground diversity, all of which is very important in terms of the transformation of food systems that Jessica referred to and the diversification of food systems. But we are losing a lot of that diversity and genetic diversity at an alarming rate. But also something that is very much tied up in the impact of more industrialized systems on loss of diversity, loss of biodiversity, is at the same time it's translating into lower diversity in terms of our microbiome. And the set of photographs, the set of photographs on the top going across are essentially from an industrialized monocropping banana production system, translating into a highly processed industrialized diet with a low diversity of microbe species in the gut of people consuming such a diet, whereas the series of photographs below show a similar thing, but from a much more biodiverse production system, a biodiversity corridor in Costa Rica, with a much higher species diversity of microbes in the gut. And this is incredibly important because as there's already been discussed a few times today and yesterday, increasingly there's evidence for the impact of the diversity of the microbiome in our gut in terms of how it contributes to improving or reducing the health of a person. But it's not just the physical health. There's also increasing evidence that the gut diversity in the microbiome is also linked to mental health. So just back to plant species, we carried out a study recently with Kew Gardens and Alexander, who presented yesterday, and did an assessment of the current edible plant species that are available. And this was in the State of the World report in 2020, and essentially it's over 7,000 species that are now documented or assessed as being edible plant species. But of course, very few of those are actually considered as food crops around the world, and the figure standing at 417. And that's a vast amount of diversity to deal with, and in many instances it can actually be overwhelming in terms of how you think about how you might diversify food systems, agri-food systems, agricultural production, and the barriers and challenges that exist to trying to mainstream or integrate diversity into food systems. And one of the starting points in many instances is to try and better understand the nutritional value of that biodiversity. So this is just an example of a new project that the Alliance is in partnership with the American Heart Association, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, called the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. And really it's a project that has been set up, and we've prioritized just over about 1,600 plants and animal species that are going to be subjected to state-of-the-art nutritional composition analysis in terms of trying to bring these underutilized species into diversification of agri-food systems. So that's a project that has just started. But I just wanted to very quickly end in terms of a couple of practical examples of projects that we've been involved in a couple of projects that have looked at trying to better mainstream food biodiversity into agricultural production and into the food systems. And I'm going to concentrate on a project called the Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition Project, which was all about mainstreaming biodiversity for improved nutrition and health. I'd also like to just end off just talking a little bit about the power of public food procurement as a potential game changer for food system transformation. But of course, there's also many other opportunities, many other solutions. And I think the second part of this session on food systems transformation is going to look more at those solutions. Things like food as medicine, food for life. There's increasing work in terms of medics, medical doctors prescribing nutritious food from community gardens, from other sorts of community-supported agriculture. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about nature-based solutions for health, planetary health, and One Health. And mainstreaming food biodiversity through all of those potential solutions is very important. So I just wanted to talk to you and finish off by highlighting some of the work that we were doing on the Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition project. And I mentioned the importance of strengthening the knowledge base. This is just an example of some of the nutritional composition analysis that we did for 70 native species in Brazil, and you can see on the right-hand side the superior nutritional value of those exotic species compared to the more common exotic species on the left. When you have that kind of evidence, you can use it in very constructive ways. And in Brazil, we use that sort of evidence to lobby and work with decision makers to put in place what essentially is the very first national policy that identifies this native biodiversity, socio-biodiversity, as it's called in Brazil. And that's very important because it facilitates the inclusion of this sort of biodiversity in public procurement programs, school feeding programs, and other similar initiatives.
Danny?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, just I'll finish off. This is, I think, the last few slides, Francesco. You can also use that knowledge and evidence to mainstream this kind of biodiversity into food-based dietary guidelines. And also, we worked with school feeding programs in Brazil to incorporate and mainstream this food biodiversity into the national school feeding program. And for the very first time in Brazil, they now actually monitor the quality of weekly meals and the contribution of socio-biodiversity and regional foods in Brazil. Just some examples of the awareness raising that we did in Brazil, working with school dietitians, school nutritionists, school chefs, and also high-profile chefs to promote this kind of socio-biodiversity. And we also developed the first national biodiversity recipe book to support a lot of that work in schools. I mentioned the power of public food procurement, and I think this is very important in terms of diversifying our food systems because it can dictate the type of food that we procure or purchase in public food procurement, the type of food from which kind of systems, agroecological, sustainable systems, and from whom marginal groups like indigenous peoples and also women's and other custodians of this biodiversity. And just to finish off, a lot of the work that we've been doing in the BFN project contributed to a number of publications that we brought out with WHO in terms of mainstreaming biodiversity for nutrition and health, and they're widely available in open access. And a lot of the work that I've just described is available in these 3 publications. And if anybody, these are all open access. If anybody is interested in copies of these, then just grab me and I can provide you with the information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danny, for giving us the complexity of the biodiversity issue. So it's not only about a number of crops, it's about the genetic diversity within a crop, and it's about also the different components of life, in particular the microbiome. So I'm happy that we have all the panelists on stage because I would like to have now a discussion around this first part of our conversation, which is about the challenges. And let me maybe summarize again the 10 challenges that Jessica brought to us. Climate impact and environmental degradation, yield and nutritional quality of crops, use of land, zoonosis, biodiversity loss, inequities, unhealthy diets, malnutrition, emergencies, and power imbalances. So maybe I'll just asking you a question, Jess. Is there alignment between these objectives on health, environment, and socioeconomics? Now, they may be pulling in different directions. What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, I think there's synergies, of course, but I think what we're experiencing now are a lot of trade-offs, particularly with usually economic growth winning out over public health and nutrition. But I think taking a food systems approach allows for co-benefits for health, environment, and socioeconomic goals. And a potentially important role in achieving those policy goals in all of those areas. I think taking a food systems approach allows for that. So you could have nutritious foods that promote health and align with food-based dietary guidelines. You could have food supply chains that support environmental sustainability through the production, processing, distribution of nutritious foods, while supporting environmental sustainability, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then you can also have private sector, including farmers, entrepreneurs, small and medium scale enterprises, businesses, create jobs and generate wealth equitably by creating an economy around nutritious foods that would directly generate decent jobs and equitably shared economic wealth. So there are co-benefits, I would say, Francesco. But right now we're seeing some priorities taken over others, and with that, a lot of trade-offs. So, but there is the possibility to do that coherence, and I think you know that better than anyone of the potential co-benefits, but we're just not seeing that political action in that way right now.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and I do agree that we need to start from that awareness of the potential and maybe really give some of the demonstration and the numbers that indeed is possible. So let me go to Danny, and Danny, following up on what Jessica just said, if we want to demonstrate the co-benefits and if we want to really preserve biodiversity, what would a diet protecting biodiversity look like?
Thank you, Francesco. Well, firstly, I think one that uses a lot of the food biodiversity that I've highlighted in the presentation would be a major contribution to that. Jess has already highlighted the importance of a plant-based diet, and obviously that is also contextual. She highlighted especially in more wealthy countries in terms of the consumption of animal products. Also a diet that's low in ultra-processed foods, I think is important to a diet that protects biodiversity. And of course, a lot of the food biodiversity that I've been talking about is often produced according to agroecological principles or regenerative agriculture approaches. So it in its own way also contributes to environmental sustainability and conserves biodiversity. And also I think diets that focus on production from smallholder farmers, from family farmers, is quite important in terms of a diet that protects biodiversity, because ultimately it's smallholders, family farmers, indigenous communities, women, who are the custodians of a lot of the genetic diversity that I was highlighting.
Well, great, thank you very much. I think this is a clear set of actions, and you've summarized well plant-based diets, curb animal source food, low in ultra-processed foods, and then it's not only the consumer aspect, but the production aspect, agroecological and smallholder farmers. It's a very good recipe, and I wonder if I can call in Vanida now. As I said, and welcome again, Vanida. Vanida is a representative of the Thai government. So I wonder how she reacts to this suggestions. And we know that actually the Thai government has been a champion of the promotion of healthy diets. Now, is sustainability, the way it was defined by Jess and Danny, a concern that is integrated in the vision of dietary change that the Thai government has?
Thank you, Francesco, and I would like to thank PMAC Secretariat to include me for a very prestigious conference. I think maybe only me that not come from medical science or health field, but agriculture. I heard a lot with even our two presenter list all the challenges, and the cost is in somehow production side. I think when we take a food system approach and be in a discussion at the global levels, would like to see the transformation of the food system. If we transform, maybe we achieve the 2030 SDGs. So those are the sustainability in all dimensions: economic, social, and environment. I have to say that for Thailand government, our 20-year national strategy was drafted and used the SDG 2030, which is the Agenda 2030, as the basis of how we implement the 20 years national strategy. So what we're doing at the government, at the high-level policy, at all ministry and all government function, it's already toward that. And then from the Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperatives, we involved in the UN Food System Summit in 2021. And those are when we are aware that food system is very complex, and it's more complex than what we deal with in the agriculture. Our first dialogue when we're talking, we took food security and health, and we try to understand what does it mean. Interestingly, even in Thailand, we have national committee sitting chaired by Minister of Health. There are two acts, Food Security Acts and the Health Acts. All those are going toward healthy person, healthy people, healthy diets, and healthy planets. But there's quite a lot of challenge because there are many agencies. And then I have to say that when we look at, just like today, we talk about climate change, biodiversity, and health. Are there only consumer side? Where are the producer side? So I think for the challenge, how we balance it, how we identify the co-benefits, and how we can identify the trade-off. There's nothing win all, lose all. There's some win, there's some lose at each step. So I think that's the challenge. So if we discuss climate, biodiversity, and agriculture, and environment. So for what we're doing, we have five objectives of the pathway. The first one is healthy diets for all. I think when we take healthy, we talk about vegetable, and I think it looks like what Danny said, that the diversity on the market. Maybe we only provide in the modern trade shelf, maybe about 30 or 35 varieties of a vegetable on the shelf. But actually on the ground, we have more than that. If you go to the north, the south, we have different cuisine with different vegetable. And those are some of the nutrition there. And there are many research, but how food security and nutrition can go hand in hand and help us design a diet that can be healthy at all time. And when we talk about food loss, food waste, I don't mention that because it's climate change, and I think about we try to halve the loss. But food loss is in the production. Food waste is in consumption. But methodology to identify food loss is just coming up for the indicator of the SDG. But there are a lot of food waste. Are these balanced? And I think the focus today I like to touch up is the nature-based solution production. There's a lot of solution. When we talk about nature-based, how we are climate smart production, climate smart agriculture, how can we mainstream biodiversity into agriculture? Because biodiversity is our nature. We use biodiversity, genetic resources in order to produce product, produce different kinds of services. We talk about soil, we talk about water. At the end of the day, what we're looking at is sustainable agriculture. So I think that our experience, maybe I try to focus that. The last year we've been working, identify what does it mean mainstreaming biodiversity into agriculture. And we have just a very short time, we have national dialogue. It seems that there's so many action on the ground. The question is, what is the evidence that can be considered as an activity that identify as the mainstreaming? If those are evidence, these are activity, those kind of things that we can be encouraged and promote. If something that have a threat to the biodiversity, those can be mitigated or have other incentive to take away for a better one. And we have an international dialogue. Maybe you can Google and you will see that we posted. We see that with all at the level, COP27 talk about food system, how to transform within the various of UNFCCC. COP15 just agree on the post-2020, but those are in the environment section. But what agriculture and food is with the FAO, which we're doing. I think what we've been doing is that we agree with the for better, which is ever better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life. So I think those one is the one we're working on. And today, maybe I take opportunity. The challenge and the solution is the partnership. How can agriculture and production be partner with health, be partner with biodiversity, and partner with climate change? So I think that's how when we identify and we will achieve it.
Dr. Vanita, we'll actually, thank you. We don't want to take all the points that you will take in your presentation, which is coming next. But thank you for this, and particularly for highlighting the central role of health in somehow driving all this agenda. But I'd like to go to Abigail and really asking her if there's an understanding in the youth community of the challenges posed by the food system, in the same way that there seems to be an understanding about the energy sector.
Thank you, Francesco. That's actually an excellent question, and there are two different answers to it, really. So the first part would be yes. I do think that persons and young people specifically understand that there is a challenge that is posed to the extent that is the understanding to the extent that is seen in the energy sector, maybe not as much, but that is something that we can work on with education. Additionally, I think one of the things that actually happens with in terms of food systems is that it's something that it actually requires change. It also requires sacrifice. And when you think of energy sector, you may say, okay, I don't need a car. I can catch a train. The train is going to get me there fast. I don't have to go through traffic. There's nothing that I'm sacrificing by taking the train as opposed to driving a car. But when you think of transforming your food system, there's sacrifice that has to come there. And I think we tend, persons in general, not young people, but persons in general tend to shy away from making those sacrifices. I think yesterday one of the speakers would have made mention to when you ask persons about 10 things that they've had to do to sacrifice since, when you compare it to COVID and when you think about climate change. And for COVID, you can see the sacrifices they've made. I've had to social distance. I've had to wear masks. But when it comes to climate change and more specifically food systems, nobody wants to cut out the food that they're eating. You like what you're eating. You like the beef. You like it however it's prepared. I'm not the best cook, so I can't give options of how it's prepared. But you like to eat it. So sacrifice is one of the things I think that is actually posing a significant challenge towards making positive gain in terms of food system transformation, not just in terms of youth, but in when it comes in relation to the general population as a whole.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you. I think you're quite right. I mean, changing habits requires greater effort, but also, of course, the environment around us is making those choices very difficult. So, yes. Now, I can't see if there's any questions there, but I would like to maybe invite comments or questions in this first part of our conversation before we go to the additional presentation from Vanida and Abigail that would focus perhaps a bit more on the response side. So if there's any question from the audience, I would like to give them the opportunity now. Is there any question from the audience? Can you help me see if there is anybody who wants to come in? Yes.
Hello, Francesco. I am here.
Good
name
morning. Wonderful.
Good morning. My name is Marcos Filardi. I come from People's Health Movement also. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question goes to Danny Hunter. Thank you for that. And particularly the loss of biodiversity as a consequence of the increasing concentration in the seed market. And particularly, as you know, right now we have 4 corporations that concentrate 75% of worldwide commercial species. And as a consequence of that commoditization of varieties, they've created these instruments like patents over living species and breeders' rights that have eroded this biodiversity even further. So in terms of getting back the biodiversity we lost, what's your opinion on what should we do in terms of challenges regarding the attempted efforts by these huge corporations to keep on controlling the varieties through these patents and breeders' rights? And my second brief question also to anyone in the panel that would like to pick it up has to do with nutritional value of food. As you, Danny, perfectly said, is quite dependent on diversity. The more diverse, the more chances of having a greater nutritional value food, but also is highly dependent on the way in which those foods are produced. And you've mentioned actually agroecological principles. So the quality of the soil and nutritional value, actually the destruction of the soil due to the agrotoxics and due to the chemical fertilizers is also having the impact of having less nutritional value food. So if you can comment on that also. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos. I wonder if there's any other question from the audience before we go to the panelists for a response. So is there any points for Jessica as well?
Yes, hi. Francesco, this is Susie Mercado. I am in charge of food systems and resiliency at the Hawaii Public Health Institute. And so very happy to hear Danny talking about the Federated States of Micronesia and the situation of island populations. I think the food systems of islands really need some special attention. And my question is this: I think from what I've learned from our work in Hawaii, what you talked about in terms of biocultural interventions is very, very important, because it's not so much about changing behavior as it is looking at food as heritage. Food is not just a commodity that you buy, but that it's heritage. As you mentioned, it includes indigenous knowledge and the wisdom of producing food in a sustainable way in the island. So my question is this: what could the health sector do to support biocultural approaches for biodiversity? Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. I like these words. I mean, heritage and wisdom. Wisdom is a word which we miss. Is there any other question? I think Sharon is there.
Yeah, thank you, Francesco. Sharon Friel from the Australian National University. Thank you so much for the panel discussion. That was amazing. Yeah, probably a question for Danny and also for Jessica. Danny, it would be just so lovely. I mean, just the analysis that you showed of down in that the level of detail. Apologies, I didn't understand all of it, but down at that level of detail, to then extrapolate so that you could almost do a supply chain analysis from sort of trade to gut. Because it struck me when you were talking about the example from the Pacific Island countries, and you mentioned about imports. A number of those countries are very attractive for imports, not just for food security for those countries, but they're also a new market when it comes to trade imports and exports. And so that relationship between trade agreements, and we've seen countries across the Pacific be decimated by trade agreements in terms of the nutrition food supply. But I just think your analysis would just lends itself to a beautiful extrapolation from gut all the way back to trade. I'd love to talk to you. And then sort of related, your question for Jessica of, the co-benefits. We did an analysis way back in 2009 looking at the co-benefits of climate change mitigation through the food system, reduction in, we fudged it, we talked about consumption, it should have been about a reduction in production of animal source foods and what that would mean for cardiovascular disease, and there would be quite a significant savings when it came to disability adjusted life years in ischemic heart disease. And when we presented that analysis, the Brazilian, and it was in the UK and Brazil, and the Brazilian ambassador said, and there would have had to have been a 30% reduction in consumption of animal source products. And the Brazilian ambassador said, you are for the birds. That is absolute nonsense. And I said, oh, well, of course, it's not the same everywhere around the world. There's, it's a contraction and convergence. In some countries, there could be an increase. In some countries, there could be a decrease. And he said, no, I'm not talking about the nutrition of Brazil. I'm talking about the economics of this. And it goes to your point of power and which interests win in those co-benefits discussions. So, yeah, it'd just be great to hear your reflections on the power question.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sharon. So we'll go back now to Danny and Jess, and then we'll hear the presentation from Vanida and Abigail. So, Danny, please.
Thanks, Francesco. Maybe Marcus first. Yeah, no, and Jessica highlighted the challenge and the problem of concentration of power of many elements of the food systems, including seed production and seed companies. No, that's also linked to this path dependency in terms of industrial food production that supports. And of course, when we were talking about the 12 food species that contribute to 75% of global calories, or the 3 species that contribute to 50%, no, it's those species that are also receiving huge perverse subsidies that also supports a lot of the corporate concentration in relation to many of those corporations that provide inputs to along the food system. So I think, yeah, no, it's a very structural, systemic political economy problem. It requires very significant changes in terms of food system governance. It's often talked about, but I think And again, in cities, we're dealing with cities that have evolved over, and civilizations that have evolved over 5,000 years to rely on intensive production from rural areas, and from the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution onwards, that path dependency has been building, and that concentration of corporate power has been increasing as well. So in terms of transformation and reversing that, that's not something that's going to happen overnight, and it's all that Andre mentioned earlier on day one, reversing these systems and achieving these paradigm shifts can oftentimes take up to 100 years, and he gave the example from democracy in Iceland. So yeah, I think there has to be new thinking about food systems governance, tackling the issue of corporate concentration of the seed industry, looking more at community-based approaches, strengthening policies that support informal seed systems and communities to control their seed production and have access to a lot more diversity of seeds. So yeah, there's a lot of work in that area. Sharon and I forgot the name of the person from Hawaii talked about.
Susie.
Lucy? Yeah.
Susie.
Susie, sorry. Food importation in the Pacifics had a huge problem in terms of not only local food production, but of course the quality of diet. And I take your point fully, Lucy, in terms of how do you draw more attention to the biocultural importance, cultural traditions of staple foods in the Pacific. And I think there's many things that you can do working with the health sector to mainstream biodiversity and its associated biocultural diversity into health programs. And the one example that I would give would be looking at food-based dietary guidelines when it comes to revising food-based dietary guidelines, actually trying to incorporate more about regional foods, biocultural foods, and culturally appropriate foods, as they did back in 2015, I think it was, in Brazil. So there was a huge focus on foods that had a very strong biocultural heritage, diversity. And Sharon, yeah, I think what you mentioned in terms of the analysis along that whole chain from uniform production to gut microbiome and microbiome, certainly well taken. Maybe I can pass on to Francesca.
Jessica,
I can't remember
yes.
a few of the other questions. The one on nutritional quality.
No, but I think you have answered. Maybe you can pass it to Jessica. No.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question around incentives and why does economics always win out? And it's the oldest question in the history of humanity of how do we overcome the elite power and the economic growth always being the trump card. And I think it's around changing incentives. I mean, let's take the beef example. There's going to be a point where it's economically not viable to raise livestock in a very, very hot world. They are big creatures. If we continue on the path now with governments and their little action on climate, it is going to be increasingly difficult to raise animals in this very hot climate. That will be not an economic incentive for Brazil, for example, to keep raising livestock and extensifying into primary forest scapes. So, and we saw that in the energy sector. We saw that the incentive for the energy transition was that renewables became very inexpensive. This is pre-Ukraine-Russia crisis. And so there was a real incentive to get into that game. Maybe it will be the same. I mean, Sharon, it's interesting around the alt proteins because for a while there was a potential market. maybe there'll come a point where we won't have a choice. We're going to have to eat alternative proteins, alt meats. We might be in a situation where it's not really, we don't have the choices to shift so much. And I really appreciated Abigail's thoughts on this. You know, people don't want to shift their diets, but you know, all the climate models suggest that choice is going to become limited if we don't take action. This vast variety, vast trading of lots of foods around the world is going to get increasingly complicated with extreme weather events and multi-breadbasket failures. So incentive structures, people will be forced to change is my guess. And there'll be trade-offs with those forced changes as well. So I don't have an answer, but I think that the energy transition that was happening, particularly in Europe, was an interesting one. And looking at the incentive structures of why that happened towards renewables is an interesting case study that we should learn from in the food system.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think you're really bringing the discussion really on the core, which is the politics and the choices that governments can make. And I know that you'll have more discussion on this in the afternoon in the session led by David Navarro. But now I would like to ask really Vanita Kamnipet to tell us specifically what the Thai government has done. She's already hinted to a partnership approach. So I'd like to call Vanita to the lectern for her presentation. And please, the panelists will stay with us for the second part of our discussion at the end of the two presentations by Vanita and Abigail.
I can take it here, or I have to be at the podium?
Whatever you prefer. I don't think you have slides, do you?
No. I think that what we're doing as a government, it's aligned with what the global agenda is. But I think the problem is how you translate the policy or the agreement that you agree at our level to the individual action. What we go through many things. I agree is what argument that been presented. But one thing is that there's so many solutions. Just like a Danny has so many study or the nutrition or the lesson learned on the success story. But sometimes when we try to make an action, where is all this information? I think this is the first challenge. How we take into account what is the information that can be trigger the change. Like Abigail said that to change what you eat is not easy. I myself too, not the young person. But how to change into the healthy diet? Can I access it? Is it affordable? Is it practical? So I think those one is the challenge, and then those are the one that we discuss with the various sector within Thailand, and as well as we have some activities that identify the vegetable. We don't, for Thai people, we don't consume enough vegetable when we consider healthy diet. But the information is so scattered. So I think this is one of the transformation that the action we need. Where is the information that ready to use when we try to make decision as the policy maker, as the individual agency, how to choose it, and then when as the individual. And I think what we try to share the idea and consult and have a dialogue with all those transformative that was identified. It's ended up that it's your job. It's not my job. I do everything good enough So I think those are the still like a silo thinking. But for Thailand, we have a very, very good quality product into that silo. But now it's just for the partnership, like a healthy diet. If we at the local with the smallholders, with the people in the rural, are they healthy already? The people in the urban, people in the city, are they healthy? So I think the way to service the healthy diet for different sector, for all, is not one solution. So without the silo we have environment, we have climate, we have health, we have agriculture, we have all other science, technology, and innovation. How we utilize that and make a recipe for success. So I think those one is what we trying to get help, at various level. As you can say that agriculture is considered as the economic. I have some example at the ASEAN, which is we are a 10-country member state in this Southeast Asia. We have 3 pillars when we work at the ASEAN. The first pillar is economic. We have social pillar and we have environment pillar. Agriculture is in economic pillar. We sit at the ASEAN Ministerial Agriculture and Forestry, which is the ministerial levels. In the agriculture is economic. But we consider biodiversity is in the pillar of environment, which is the Minister of Natural Resources and Environment sitting in, and it's 2 pillars separated. And I think this is what the partnership is. If we know what has been going with the other and it is relevant to us, that will the action will make it happen. Just like we just have agreed at the AMAF last year that we will have some work consider mainstreaming biodiversity in agriculture. So it has to cut across that pillar. So I think this one just to connect what we have experience, we are expertises, and make it into that how the individual can take action, how researcher can take action, how the people on the ground have take action. Because what we have experienced when we work with the Health Assembly, which is a civil society that work on the ground, there's so many good example and achievement on the ground. But how we collectively added on those actions to be part of the nation, I think those one is still not much existing. Because most of the national report, it makes through the survey, make to the design, or make to what we already have support budget. But if individual can do good things, can it add on? Because just like one, then we talk about sustainable agriculture. If you talk about monoculture, yes, there are quite a lot. But there's quite a lot that's sustainable also. Not all that can be bad, but there's practices that can be utilized, and those come from science, technology, and innovation, and in knowledge from academic, from the traditional knowledge, and what people practices. I think what the challenge that we can do is that knowledge and take that solution that is accessible and practical for those who can make action, because we cannot make people change. People have to decide to change. So I think the communication is one of the thing that we have to communicate and talk between sector. Maybe we have different goals, different KPI, different indicator. But at the end of the day, if we want sustainability and we want the same formula, we can share and identify what we can do. And I think it's not only government that can do, not only person that can do. Everybody has to do together. And it's not quick for transformation. Change is not quick. This is, we talk about transformation. It's just something that maybe we never seen before, we never know before. But just like Jessica say, sometimes there are force, unseen force us to change. So I think in able to change and transform the knowledge, the information, and the capability, at the end of the day, I have to say the most important one is the investment. Do we have enough investment into the action that we consider it need to be transformed? And the resources to be changed, is it enough investment? Sometimes investment is not only money, but money is important. How that prioritize, how to get the support. Even we consider to work on with ASEAN with the CGIAR, we identify what this is what we're gonna do. We have a framework, we must have guidelines, we must have information, and we set up the network. But we still don't know that we can implement it or not, because we still don't know where is the donor is, how can we implement it. But what we discuss, we know this is the priority we have to work on until we have the investment. So I think that one, it will be necessary. And we working at the ASEAN also, responsible agriculture investment, and now in Thailand, we try to take into Thai context. So I think those one is the thing that information, investment, and the people to change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vanida. You've given us, maybe we'll give our hands to Vanida for her presentation. And because also you've given us some important keywords. The first one is really the information and the dialogue. And I really would like to acknowledge the incredible work that has been done, particularly under the leadership of David Nabarro, to create food system dialogues. And also the incredible power of the dialogue, global dialogue that has been done in the preparation and during the UN Food System Summit. So the dialogue really a key word to start this transformative process. But second, you said the translation of knowledge into action. And third is investment. And what you said is not just money. It's actually political investment that we need to make. Those are the key elements of transformation. But now I'd like to really hear from Abigail, because there's probably another important transformative element, which is the power of activism. So while Abigail is going to her lectern for her presentation, I will just remember that she is a youth activist and climate change activist. Abigail, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So my presentation today is a bit different. You've heard a lot from the experts. You've heard from Dani, you've heard from Jessica, you've heard from Vanida, but today I'm speaking to you guys a bit more about the role that young people play in transforming our food systems. Additionally, we'll speak a bit about some of what would have occurred at COP27, as well as basically the role of youth activism, especially in terms of driving positive change. So getting right into it. Okay, so according to the United Nations, there are 1.2 billion young people between the ages of 15 and 24 globally. And of course, 15 to 24, that still leaves persons that are under the age of 15. And by 2030, where we have some SDG goals to be met, it is expected to have an increase to about 1.3 billion, which is a 7% increase. So I was asked to answer the question about why is youth activism important, and I didn't want to solely speak for myself, so I kind of scoured the internet so that I can get an idea of what other young people from across the globe really, what was their perspective and why youth activism is important. You get a variety of answers that range from the fact that the decisions that are made today are the ones that are going to directly affect us in the future, the fact that young people are instrumental in driving social change, that if there's any government that wants to build a strong future for their nation, they must value more so the importance of the youth voice, as well as young people, as we've just noted, are the largest source of energy that can contribute towards meaningful change. 1.2 billion young people that's a lot of people. And so this is kind of, you see there's a central theme that young people are needed, while youth activism is necessary. So, and I think this was one quote that I saw from a young person that kind of stood out for me, and it fits our agenda for today. And it says, never before has a generation been so proactive in the way we think about food and the environment. As it stands, young people are to inherit a planet that will be 4 degrees warmer, threatening the availability and nutrition quality of what they eat as well as the air they breathe. The question that has to be answered by all key players in the food systems is how are young people involved in transforming the food system so that it becomes resilient, affordable, and accessible to all? And I think that's kind of the question that we'd like to answer, not just in this session, but in the next session as we progress. So I'm not sure if any of you recognize exactly what you're looking at, or if you don't, you can see that there's almost like a clear boundary, like a clear demarcation between these two land masses. On the left, there it looks very desolate. There's hardly any greenery, and then on the right, you can see that there's greenery. And this is actually the border between that divides Haiti and the Dominican Republic, with Haiti being on the left and the Dominican Republic being on the right. Haiti is one of the most deforested countries in the world. And around the 1920s, 60% of the Haitian territory was covered by forests, and now you have about 2%, and that's, well, you can tell that's why it looks that way from the aerial picture. And the main reason for this really is due to the production of charcoal, which is the main source of energy for the population. I think one of the reasons that I chose to highlight Haiti specifically is because many of the times we speak about food system change, but we don't make mention to the fact that change, it requires some sort of financial input, and that's often not the case for many persons. You can't tell the person who maybe who's using, who has no source of energy, who may not have access to clean water, who may not have access to food, that what you're doing is wrong. I mean, surely you can, but you cannot expect them to change without providing a means or an input for them to do so. So what is being done? So, young people in Haiti, along with some international organizations, have coupled, as well as the government, so that have partnered in essence, as they've kind of undertook this massive reef afforestation program. There's also been like this program where young people they have like this externship, and they go overseas for a year, and they get a sense of agroecology, especially what is practicing in rural areas, and they're able to bring it back to Haiti, and they can actually implement that. And this is just an example. Well, this is just one example of what can be done when you have. So you have governmental support in the country, you have international support from international organizations and international countries, as well as the fact that you're involving not only young people, but you're involving the farmers, you're involving the persons that are directly affected by generally the impacts of these complications. So what else have young people been doing around truly as it relates to food system change. And this ranges from activism to action. And what we saw just now in Haiti, that would have been a form of action, where you're actively trying to combat the problem. But we know that there are young people that are actively advocating, whether it be at the international level, the global, and the national level. They're partaking in planting trees. There are a lot of persons who have made the change to veganism, or even vegetarianism, and even if it isn't that extreme, there are persons that have made some level of change towards their diet because they understand that this is a problem. And the only way that you will solve it is being comfortable. Well, you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, truly. So the next thing that we are going to speak about, because the Conference of Parties is one of the biggest negotiation things about platforms, is what did COP27 deliver on the food system transformation. And we just have the little snippet at the bottom. There is no 1.5 degree future without transforming our industrial food systems. And I believe this was mentioned by Jessica earlier. And I think this is important for us to remember as well as we move forward. So, of course, let's talk about what happened at COP27. So, food and farming, as we know, and has been mentioned previously, accounts for about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. And however, when you get these international climate negotiations, you hardly ever have food systems being included. And I think you can see at this last COP27, which was held in Egypt, food systems were definitely on the agenda. There were over about 200 events. There were 4 pavilions, and there was an entire day dedicated to agriculture and adaptation. One of the things that did come out of the negotiations would be the Cornovia joint work on agriculture, and I'll briefly read what it is. So it's claimed to be a landmark decision under the UNFCCC that recognizes the unique potential of agriculture in tackling climate change, and it addresses 6 interrelated topics on soil, nutrient use, water, livestock, methods for assessing adaptation, and the socioeconomic and food security dimensions of climate change across the agricultural sectors. And the unfortunate reality is that after so many weeks of negotiations, this is what was produced. There were so many things that were left out. Agroecology was taken out from the draft text. There was no linking of mitigation to agriculture. You can see that it clearly states agriculture. There's no mention of food systems, as that was actually replaced with agriculture and food security. However, I guess that acknowledging that there is a problem is the first step. And there was obviously the inclusion in COP27. The only concern is that that's the 27th COP. We've been speaking about the energy sector and transforming that for a very long time, and we have gotten somewhere. And as Jessica would have mentioned, we have been making strides now due to grid parity, because renewable resources the prices decreased. It's kind of worrying to think that you've gone through 27 COPs and you're still struggling with one problem, something that has now been brought onto the agenda. How much longer how long are we going to struggle with that, truly? So it begs to state that getting the food systems on the global agenda is not enough, and it was not enough, obviously. So these were just some of the statements that were, some of the opinions that were had. And it ranges from if the actions are not incorporated across the whole food system, from food waste and loss to sustainable supply chains and healthy diets, then we fail to meet the world's great food and climate challenges, and as well as the fact that small-scale farmers have done little to cause the climate crisis, but their needs and solutions are being crowded out. And to continue, I'd like to leave one thing, more than one thing with you, but this is an important statistic. About 14.5% of global greenhouse emissions is as a result of livestock. do with that information as you must. My final point will be something that we've reiterated, not just today, but yesterday also during the plenary sessions, is that there is no 1.5-degree future without transforming away from industrial food systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abigail, for reminding us about COP27. And it's true, there was a lot of talk about food system, but we're still not at the level of energy in terms of action. And I must say that we're hoping that in COP28 something will come. And there's now an initiative on climate change and nutrition that the Egyptian government is leading in collaboration with many organizations, including FAO and WHO, that hopefully will move to the next stage, which is really implementation, or as Vanita was putting it, investment. Now, in the last 15, 20 minutes we have of our session, I really would like to ask the people in the audience to come up with questions. But first of all, I'd like to follow up with a question to Abigail and really ask her, if you have any suggestions on how to expand the civil society movement that is asking for food system transformation. Where would you start?
So I think one of the things that I came to realize when I was looking into food system transformation is that it's being done in a number of areas just under a different team. So one of the areas, something that I volunteered with back home, because we have a very high rate of childhood obesity. About 1 in 3 children in Barbados are either overweight or obese. About 1 in 5 persons have diabetes. So we've undergone this. We're trying to have the implementation of a national school nutrition policy, which seeks to do a number of things. The inclusion of physical education, but more specifically in relation to this is that you're trying to change the diets of the children, and you're doing that by limiting what it is that you're offering them. It's not, as Jessica was saying, you're taking away the choice, but you're taking it away for the better. So you're understanding that there's often a connection, and there's often things that they overlap to an extent. So individually we're but a drop, but collectively we're an ocean. So recognizing that civil society organizations from varying backgrounds can work together to achieve the same goal, because oftentimes we do have the same goal. It may manifest in different ways. We may have different ideas of how we are going to get it done, but we can work together to achieve the common goal. And I think that education as well, education across the board will play a significant role in making positive strides. And as I kind of just mentioned, for all of us really, we do have to get, at a personal level, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We are not going to achieve anything unless we actually are willing to make sacrifices. And hopefully, some of us have passed that stage already, but hopefully most of us are heading there.
Thank you, Abigail. And I see that you were suggesting basically that somehow the health movement and the environmental movement come together, because of course, the concern is for people and the planet. So what Barbados is doing, also in the context of the whole small island development state action movement, is a good example on how to bring those two elements together. But can I go to Jess, still talking about COP27 and COP28. What would you suggest to include in the nationally determined contribution for COP28, Jessica?
Well, I think for COP28 to be successful for food, we definitely need Abigail at COP28 plus. The many Abigails. Abigail, you're going to need to figure out how to clone yourself. But I think we spent 26 COPs, and prior to that, a failure to even include and acknowledge the burning of fossil fuels. It took 26 COPs, Francesco, to acknowledge that. And even then, in the final negotiating text, it fell flat. I think with food, we're getting there. You know, every year, slowly, you see more and more prominence of the food agenda intermingling with the climate agenda, but it's never really hard hitting and sitting at the negotiating table. It came closer last year, but it's still not sufficient. So to me, of course, actually having food being negotiated at COP28 will be really important. Obviously, things like ensuring alignment of food system policies and agriculture support that doesn't overlap with climate policy interactions or contradict climate policy interactions. There's a lot of trade-offs that come with some of these NDCs. The other big one would start accounting for emissions coming from food systems, whether it be food imports and trade, deforestation, a conversion of ecosystems, extensification into forestscapes. That's just accounting and acknowledging that the food systems are contributing up to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, and accounting for those will be really important in the NDCs. And the big one, of course, targets and measures to reduce food loss and waste would be an important contribution into NDCs. And last, and probably the most hesitant by governments, is targets and measures towards healthier and more sustainable diets. That's the most politically challenging one. Governments don't want to touch that. I think Abigail had mentioned that earlier. People don't want to change their diets. Governments don't want to be paternalistic in how people should eat. And so that's sort of a hands-off topic, but we know that diets are big contributors to greenhouse gases and environmental degradation. So it's really unfortunate that maybe the talks would only focus on food loss and methane reduction, but there's a whole piece on diets that I don't think we'll see for a long time. That's me being a bit, cynical, but having watched all the COPs sort of come and go in my older age and never really seen food on the agenda, I think it's coming, but it's going to be slow and it's going to be bit by bit. But I think the food system community is fighting the good fight to get it on the agenda, and every year they'll get closer to the point where hopefully there'll be some tracking of emissions and some accountability.
Thanks, Jess. I think that's a very good starting point. So you mentioned somehow what can go in those national determined contribution. The accounting for emissions, the food loss and waste, the target for sustainable diet, actually even inclusion of sustainability in food-based dietary guidelines would be a good starting point. Now the point is how we make...
And the United States could start doing that as well. But the U.S. food-based dietary guidelines are kicking off. Maybe this time around they'll acknowledge sustainability, being that the United States are huge greenhouse gas emitters.
Oh, no, and we do have excellent examples around the world on how this could be done, absolutely. But now, the politics. Can I go back to maybe Vanida and Danny on the politics? And I know you've been collaborating in the ASEAN strategy. Vanida, you mentioned the ASEAN strategy. So probably some of this regional collaboration can be important and powerful, and they can come together to help moving this agenda at COP28. So Vanida and then Danny, would you like to say how you think, if you think that actually the Asian strategy can help providing this political collaboration and political momentum to make something happen at COP28? Vanida.
That's a difficult question, but it's the question I ask myself too. But I think with the movement that when we have the leaders at all levels sit together and they agree on something, the policy is very broad, but that gives us the way and justify the priority of work. So I think those one that we work at the high level, those are the things that we looking for. And I think at the ASEAN, I have to say that within the, I can talk only with the agriculture, fishery, and forestry that we are looking after, which is AMAF, ASEAN Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. Next year, we will discuss on sustainable agriculture, which is in those maybe talk about how we have alternatives, how we take into account of climate change or other biodiversity, not only look at productivities, not only looking at the economic benefits. So I think those one is in the pipeline. Or last year, Thailand just have being a chair of the APEC. And that's some of the agreement through those discussions. We have implementation action plan on food security that will achieve the SDG by 2030. And those of action that we talking about and identify with the various government and people that we're dealing with are in those activities, just like how we can reduce the lost food waste, how can we reduce the chemical use in agriculture. So I think those are the things that if we have the goals together, that's the action we identify. It has to be injected at all levels, high level policy, national policy, agency policy, but most of all, we have to communicate with the people that will act on it. So I think how we communicate to the farmers, to the practitioners, and to other sectors in the community. So I think those are the things that we're looking right now, how we will have the resilience for the local community for the food system transformation. Just have the definition to start with. I think those are the things that are trouble. But I think for all those political, if we have a clear definition and a clear goal, we always make action plan and make it happen with the right stakeholders. Yes.
Thank you, Vanida. I actually count on Thailand leadership for next COP28. So we'll definitely continue this conversation. And maybe I'd like to go to Danny now and try to bring in another difficult word, which is the word governance. So how do you think that food system governance could work to address these challenges and barriers?
Thanks, Francesca. Maybe I could just highlight one example, and it relates to the biodiversity for food and nutrition work that we were doing in Brazil. And I think one of the boldest efforts that I've been exposed to in my experience, an attempt to achieve transformation, was what the Lula government did about 15 years ago in terms of putting in place the Zero Hunger Strategy, or the VOMO Zero Hunger Strategy, which was a multi-sectoral platform that came together involving all sectors, academia, research, and also had very considerable accountability to civil society in that mechanism. And I think in its short time, it did achieve a lot in terms of addressing poverty, nutrition, but also other multiple benefits. Again, I think it's an example of a strategy that's at the whim of political cycles. When a government loses power, what happens to that kind of thing that was put in place. But there's been a few things mentioned this week already about the Lula government being back in power, and the importance that has in relation to issues around the Amazon and conservation in the Amazon. I would also like to, well, I also wonder what it also means to what was put in place earlier in terms of food systems governance in Brazil through that zero hunger strategy, because it was really a very significant effort at putting in place very joined up food policies across food security, across nutrition, across health, but also in terms of environmental sustainability and biodiversity conservation. There were a range of incentives that were put in place to promote diversification, agroecological production. There was also premiums determined for the procurement of food biodiversity, or what they call socio-biodiversity in Brazil, and also the school feeding program. There were laws introduced, things like 30% of the food procured for school feeding had to come from local family farmers, and in many instances they were custodians of a lot of that food biodiversity, that food diversity. So as a project operating in Brazil in that context, there were a lot of low-hanging fruit. There was a lot of entry points that we were able to hang our coats on in terms of supporting a lot of that work. At the time, so there was a lot of appetite for knowledge and information on the nutritional value of a lot of the native biodiversity in Brazil that wasn't in place before. There was no policy in place that actually officially recognized Brazilian native biodiversity or socio-biodiversity. So the policy on socio-biodiversity that identified and formally recognized 100 native species of nutritional value is the only example that I'm aware of anywhere in the world that does that. There's no other countries that I'm aware of that are doing that kind of thing. And that was quite important because there wasn't a great deal of understanding what socio-biodiversity actually constituted. So having that formal recognition in that policy that was put in place by the Ministry of Social Development and the Ministry of Environment was critical in terms of trying to make some attempt at mainstreaming food biodiversity into public procurement and into school feeding programs in Brazil. So I think that's, to me, in many ways, a gold standard in terms of what countries can do in terms of introducing a governance system that is more amenable to trying to achieve transformation in food systems and food production and more broadly than that as well. But again, it can be very quickly undermined by changes in government, as was
absolutely
demonstrated in Brazil.
Thank you, Danny. And actually, we'll see if now Sharon will receive a different answer from the Brazilian government. But maybe just I'd like to give the floor the opportunity of one final comment, if there's anybody wants to do that in the audience.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, David, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
There's two of us by the mic.
Thank you.
Oh, I cannot see the microphone, sorry.
Okay, good morning. My name is Dr. Carol Zabaleta. I am from Peru, and I would like to touch this topic about biodiversity, health, and nutrition. I am wondering if we can reflect on those locations and geographies where there's still consumption of biodiversity in their diet. Are those populations healthier than those in the less biodiverse diet is consumed? This is because in my personal experience working in the beautiful Amazon in Peru with indigenous people, more than 60% of community members have anemia, and more than 50% of children were stunned. So how we can assure that rich biodiversity is really reflect on higher and better health and nutritional indicators and well-being, especially for vulnerable populations in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And please, David?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. David Nabarro, two things. First of all, it was a wonderful session and really, really valuable. And we've got another food system session at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and I want to try to be sure that there is a connection of thought between the two. And several of the participants in this afternoon session have been listening and taking notes on this morning. Secondly, I know COP28 is really important, and there's a lot of groups putting a lot of hope on bringing food and nutrition much more strongly into the climate COP process. But don't forget, there's also going to be, I understand, a stock take of progress since the Food Systems Summit of September 2021, and that's due to take place, though there are still some arrangements to be finalized, around July this year. So there is some other opportunities besides the climate COP to really push the points that I think have come through so strongly this morning. I hope panelists agree. I realize we're short of time, so that's more a comment rather than a question. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, colleague from Peru. I don't think we have time for another round of comments from the panelists, but I'd like to maybe wrap up, first of all, by thanking you all for the valuable contributions. And I think it's been an interesting discussion going all the way from the challenges to the opportunities for change. You will discuss more the solutions and the change this afternoon, as David was saying. I also would like to add that we may be a little bit more optimistic, because at the UN Food System Summit has in fact triggered a number of actions. Many actors from civil society, from the private sector, from governments have been interacting and are putting in place some important transformative actions. We also understand that there are many components of our work, and sectors are being much more aware of what they need to do, not just the environment. I would like also to mention water and sanitation. The whole agenda there may need to be connected to the food system transformation agenda. So we've heard how there is awareness, or there is growing awareness about the challenges, and there is leadership coming from countries, and there is leadership coming from civil society movement, particularly the youth. That transformative change gives us great opportunities. So I'd like to close this session by giving ourselves a bit more hope that, with better understanding, with better dialogue, we should be a bit more in control of what's happening. So Jessica, you can go and have a good rest and have hopefully good dreams with this great vision in mind. And thank you very much for all. And maybe we'll close by thanking everybody for the conversation. Thank you and goodbye.